The city park lay draped in the early evening hush. A tranquil escape from the noise and rush of the day. The sky above deepened into shades of purple and navy blue. As dusk softened the world, street lamps flickered on, casting a warm glow over winding paths and patches of grass where families walked together. Couples strolled hand in hand, and children's laughter echoed from the playground. In the midst of this calm, on a small concrete path near the swings, Alice Dixon stood, steady and focused, her eyes on her daughter. Sarah, Alice, tall and athletic with a quiet strength, watched as her 10-year-old daughter positioned herself on a skateboard. Her heart swelled with pride as she noticed Sarah's intense concentration, her small face scrunched up in determination. Tonight was special, a rare evening with no work distractions, no responsibilities except to be here, teaching her daughter the basics of skateboarding, a skill Alice had learned on rougher streets years ago. She chuckled softly, recalling her younger self, fearless and defiant, cutting through the neighborhood on her board, feeling free in a world that so often tried to contain her. Sarah wobbled as she placed one foot on the skateboard. Alice quickly extended her arms, ready to catch her if needed. "Keep your knees bent, baby," she said, her voice calm and encouraging. "And if you feel like you're going to fall, don't fight it, just let yourself fall naturally. I'm here, you'll be fine." Sarah glanced up, eyes wide with trust and admiration. "Like you, Mama?" she asked, a hint of pride in her voice. Alice smiled, her chest tightening with a mix of joy and hope. "Just like me, sweetheart, brave, steady, and unafraid." For a few blissful moments, Alice forgot the burdens that usually weighed on her. Being a single mother, working multiple jobs, facing countless challenges, these things could wait. Tonight, she was simply Sarah's mother, a role she cherished above all else. She watched with delight as Sarah balanced for a few seconds longer each time, the girl's face lighting up with every tiny victory. Alice's joy, however, was fleeting. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure moving toward them. Her instinct, honed by years of navigating difficult spaces, brought an involuntary tension to her body. She recognized him immediately: Officer Mark Copeland, a man known across the neighborhood, though not for reasons any would proudly mention. He wore the hardened, cynical expression of someone who had long since forgotten the ideals of his badge, if he ever believed in them at all. Alice's heart sank. She knew this type. She'd encountered men like Copeland too many times before, men who saw her skin color as a threat, who carried their biases in every gesture, every glance, men who believed they had a right to dictate where she could and could not go. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. She didn't want to alarm Sarah, who was still focused on balancing on the skateboard, oblivious to the approaching officer. Copeland stopped just a few feet away, his stance aggressive and his eyes cold. His gaze swept over her, then landed on Sarah with a flicker of disdain. Without so much as a greeting, he barked, "You don't belong here." The harshness of his words echoed through the quiet park, shattering the peaceful moment. Sarah's eyes darted toward him, confusion clouding her expression as she looked back at her mother. Alice felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she forced herself to hold steady, stepping slightly in front of Sarah to shield her. "We're just enjoying the park, officer," she replied, her voice measured, her gaze steady. "It's public property. We have every right to be here." Copeland's eyes narrowed, and he took a deliberate step closer, intruding on her personal space. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" His tone was dripping with contempt, as if her very presence was an offense. He glanced at Sarah, who had instinctively moved closer to her mother, clutching her skateboard tightly, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Alice felt her fists clench at her sides, 1,000 memories of similar encounters flashing through her mind. But she kept her voice calm, her expression unwavering. "I don't know what you think we're doing here, but we're not causing any trouble. My daughter is just learning to skateboard. That's all." A harsh, mocking laugh escaped Copeland's lips. "Oh, I bet. Teaching her to break rules early. Huh? Starting them young, just like the rest of you." Each word was like a jagged stone, thrown with the intent to provoke, to break through her calm exterior. Alice felt her control slipping, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. But she knew that reacting would only make things worse. Men like Copeland thrived on control. On seeing others cower. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Not here. Not in front of Sarah. Still, her silence seemed to enrage him. With an air of impatience, he stepped even closer, towering over her, his sneer now a mask of hatred. Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respect, he hissed. Then, in one shocking, unprovoked motion, he raised his hand and slapped Alice across the face. The force of the blow was staggering, making her stumble back a step, the sting radiating across her cheek. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. A gasp escaped Sarah, her small voice breaking the silence as her eyes filled with terror. Her gaze darting between her mother and the officer. Alice straightened, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch her cheek. She felt the heat of the slap. The pain. But what hurt more was the humiliation, the open, blatant show of power meant to degrade her. Meant to remind her of her supposed place. But as she looked at Sarah's frightened face, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Sarah, who was watching, learning what it meant to face the world as a black woman. This was about every moment she'd been forced to stand down. Every time someone had told her to know her place. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all those years, all those injustices, coalescing into one clear, unbreakable resolve. With a calm she hadn't felt in years, Alice met Copeland's gaze, her eyes hard and steady. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink away. Instead, she took a step forward, narrowing the space between them until she could feel his breath. Her voice was low, but each word carried a strength that surprised even her. "You had no right to touch me," she said, her tone unwavering. "I haven't done anything wrong. And you know it. Whatever authority you think you have, it doesn't give you the right to assault people. Not me. And not anyone." A flicker of doubt flashed across Copeland's face, quickly replaced by anger. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. A mixture of surprise and fury at her defiance. She could see it, the disbelief that she hadn't backed down. Hadn't cowered. "You think you're brave, don't you?" he sneered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You think I won't put you in your place?" Alice held his gaze, her chin lifting slightly, her expression unyielding. "You can try," she replied coolly, "but you'll regret it." For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. A momentary realization that he had underestimated her. And in that tiny pause, that slight hesitation, Alice knew she had won something. She hadn't just stood her ground, she had shown Sarah, and perhaps herself, that no one, not even a man with a badge, had the power to strip away her dignity. As she pulled Sarah close, her heart still pounding, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet, unyielding strength. This was just the beginning. Alice's cheek still burned with the sting of Officer Copeland's hand as she led Sarah away from the confrontation. Her daughter clutching her hand tightly. Every step felt heavy, her thoughts racing, heart pounding as she fought the overwhelming surge of anger and humiliation that simmered beneath her calm exterior. But even as she walked, she felt something change deep inside her resolve. A quiet fury she hadn't known before. She'd had enough of being humiliated and pushed around. Copeland's arrogance, his abuse of power, she wouldn't let him get away with it. Not this time. They found a bench under the cover of a large oak tree at the edge of the park. Alice sat down, pulling Sarah close as she took a few deep breaths. Steadying herself, Sarah looked up at her mother, her eyes wide and confused. Alice could see the unspoken question in her daughter's gaze. The silent, fearful "why?" that hung in the air between them. "What did we do wrong, Mama?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her small hands clinging tightly to her mother's arm. Alice swallowed hard, her gaze softening as she looked down at her daughter. How could she explain the injustice, the prejudice, that they had just experienced? She couldn't let Sarah believe it was her fault, that somehow they deserved this treatment. She had to make sure her daughter understood her worth, even when the world tried to tell her otherwise. "We didn't do anything wrong, baby," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. Sometimes people, especially people like him, think they can treat others differently just because of how they look. But that doesn't mean it's right. And it doesn't mean we have to accept it. Sarah's brows furrowed, her young mind trying to grasp the complexity of her mother's words. Alice wrapped her arms around her, holding her close, feeling the rise and fall of her daughter's breaths. Her small body pressed against her own. The anger, the humiliation, all seemed to melt away in the warmth of that embrace, replaced by a fierce, protective love. But her peace was short-lived. Just as Alice was about to gather herself to leave the park, she noticed movement nearby. Her heart sank as she saw Copeland again. And this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought 2 other officers, their faces cold and expressionless, but their eyes filled with a smug certainty that chilled her to the bone. Alice's grip on Sarah tightened as the 3 officers approached, their heavy footsteps crunching against the gravel. "Well, look who thinks she's some kind of hero," Copeland sneered, his voice cutting through the quiet evening air like a blade. "You thought you could just walk away?" Alice forced herself to stay calm, her gaze unflinching as she met Copeland's eyes. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. One of the other officers stepped forward, a younger man with close-cropped blonde hair and a calculating expression. "We got a report of a disturbance," he said, his tone dripping with accusation. "Apparently, someone decided to assault an officer." Alice's stomach twisted. Assault? The absurdity of the accusation made her want to scream. She had done nothing wrong, she had only defended herself. She could feel Sarah trembling beside her. Could feel the weight of the office's collective gaze pressing down on her. An oppressive force designed to intimidate. To make her feel small and powerless. But she wasn't going to let them see her fear. "I didn't assault anyone," Alice replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "Your friend here crossed the line. He's the one who assaulted me." The younger officer exchanged a glance with Copeland, who glared at Alice, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. "Watch your mouth," he snapped, taking a step closer. "You're already in enough trouble as it is." Sarah's small hand tightened around Alice's arm, and Alice felt the pulse of her daughter's heartbeat racing against her skin. She knew she had to stay calm. For Sarah's sake, if nothing else. These men wanted to provoke her, to push her into reacting, to give them a reason to escalate the situation further. Another officer, the older one with graying hair and a hard, worn face, looked Alice over with disdain. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson in respect," he muttered, his tone filled with contempt. Alice's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her anger in check. Her voice was quiet but laced with a fierce resolve. "Respect is earned," she replied, her gaze steady. "And none of you have earned mine today." The younger officer sneered, his lips curling in a way that made Alice's skin crawl. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he taunted, stepping closer until he was nearly nose to nose with her. "People like you always think they're above the law." Alice's voice was calm, almost icy, as she met his gaze unflinchingly. "I respect the law," she said, each word deliberate, "when it's fair, but that doesn't mean I have to respect you." A murmur rose from a small crowd that had started to gather, their whispers filled with disbelief and anger. Alice felt a surge of strength at their presence, their silent support like a lifeline. She glanced around, noticing the faces of bystanders, their expressions a mixture of concern and outrage as they watched the officers harassing her and Sarah. But Copeland was not deterred. If anything, the growing crowd only seemed to fuel his anger. His face twisted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think bringing in an audience will save you?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "I could arrest you right now if I wanted to." Alice didn't flinch. "You can try," she said, her voice cold and steady. "But you'll regret it." For a moment, Copeland seemed taken aback, as if her defiance was something he hadn't anticipated. His hand twitched, hovering near his belt as if considering reaching for his handcuffs. But then he glanced around, his gaze sweeping over the crowd that had gathered, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions unflinching. In that moment, something shifted. Alice could see the doubt flicker in his eyes, a realization that he was no longer in control, that his actions were being witnessed by far too many people. His bravado faltered, his expression turning from anger to uncertainty. Then, from within the crowd, a voice spoke up, a calm, firm voice that carried a weight of authority. "What's going on here?" All heads turned to see a man approaching, his gaze steady and unyielding as he surveyed the scene. He was tall, with a salt and pepper beard and a serious expression, dressed in civilian clothes but with an air of authority that couldn't be mistaken. Alice felt a surge of relief wash over her, a glimmer of hope as the man stopped beside her, positioning himself between her and the officers. "I'm asking you a question, officers," the man continued, his tone sharp. "What exactly is going on here?" Copeland's face flushed, his confidence cracking as he tried to maintain control. "Nothing to worry about, sir," he said, his voice strained. "Just handling a disturbance." The man's gaze shifted to Alice and Sarah, his expression softening as he took in their frightened but resolute faces. He looked back at Copeland, his eyes narrowing. "Doesn't look like nothing to me," he said, his voice steady. "In fact, it looks like harassment." Alice could feel the tension in the airshift, the officers exchanging uncertain glances as the man's presence cast a heavy shadow over their authority. He turned back to Alice, giving her a small, reassuring nod. She didn't know who he was, but in that moment, he was her lifeline, her shield. "Name's Derek Owens," he said, addressing the officers. "Civil rights attorney. I know exactly what your duties are, and I can tell you that nothing I've seen here falls within your mandate to serve and protect." Copeland's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as he glared at Owens. But he didn't move, didn't argue. He knew who Owens was, knew the power he wielded in the courtroom. He knew that pushing further would only lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. As the crowd murmured in agreement, their support building like a wave around her, Alice felt a newfound strength surge through her. She stood tall, her gaze steady, her hand gripping Sarah's. For the first time, she felt truly seen, truly supported. And as Copeland and his officers turned to leave, muttering under their breath, Alice knew that this was only the beginning. She had stood her ground today, but she was ready for whatever came next. For herself, for Sarah, and for every person who had ever been silenced, she was ready to fight. The following morning, the warmth of the sunrise crept across Alice's small kitchen, casting golden light on the walls. She sat at the table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the answers to all her questions. Her mind replayed the events in the park, the slap, the humiliation, the searing look of disdain on Officer Copeland's face. Every detail haunted her, lingering in her thoughts like an unshakable shadow. Sarah wandered into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair wild from sleep. Alice's heart softened as she watched her daughter shuffle over to the table, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, Mama," Sarah murmured, giving her mother a sleepy smile. Alice forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's face. "Good morning, baby. Did you sleep well?" Sarah nodded, settling onto the chair across from Alice, her eyes searching her mother's face. After a pause, she asked in a small voice, "Are we safe, Mama?" The question struck Alice like a blow. She had always prided herself on protecting Sarah, on creating a world for her daughter where love and warmth would overshadow fear. Yet here was her little girl, asking a question no 10-year-old should have to ask. Alice reached across the table, holding Sarah's small hands in hers. "Yes, baby," she said firmly, her voice filled with a quiet strength she hoped would reassure them both. "We're safe. I won't let anyone hurt us." Just then, a knock sounded at the door, breaking the stillness of the moment. Alice's heart jumped as she stood, her muscles tensing. It was early, too early for visitors. She took a steadying breath, gave Sarah a reassuring nod, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with Derek Owens, the civil rights attorney who had stepped in at the park. His expression was calm but serious, and he held a thick folder in his hands. "Good morning, Alice," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought I'd come by to see how you're holding up after everything that happened yesterday." Relief washed over her, and she gestured for him to come inside. "Please, come in. I appreciate you checking in on us." They moved to the small living room, where Alice offered him a seat. Sarah lingered in the doorway, watching them with wide eyes. Owens looked at Alice, his gaze steady. I wanted to talk to you about Officer Copeland. He began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of intensity. I did some digging last night. It turns out that your case is far from unique. He placed the folder on the table between them, opening it to reveal a stack of papers, complaints, records, and statements. These are just a few of the reports filed against him over the years. People who have been harassed, threatened, even assaulted. Alice's heart sank as she scanned the documents. Each page was a testament to the suffering of people just like her. Victims of the same abuse. The same power wielded unjustly. She felt a familiar anger rise within her, mingling with a renewed sense of purpose. She looked up at Owens, her voice barely above a whisper. How has he been allowed to get away with this for so long? Owens's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. The system protects people like him. Alice. Complaints vanish. Cases get buried. It's a cycle that keeps going because too many people are afraid to speak up or simply don't know where to turn. Alice glanced toward the kitchen where Sarah had retreated, her small voice drifting down the hall as she hummed to herself. So, what can we do? Alice asked, her voice trembling with a mix of determination and fear. I don't want this to keep happening, not to us. Not to anyone. Owens leaned forward, his expression serious. I have a plan, but it's not an easy one. I want to make your story public. Expose Copeland and his history of misconduct. I have contacts, journalists who aren't afraid to tackle these kinds of issues. Who can make sure your voice is heard? Alice's pulse quickened. The idea of going public, of laying bare her story for everyone to see, was both empowering and terrifying. She knew the risks involved. She could already hear the whispers, the doubt, the inevitable backlash. But as she looked at the stack of complaints, at the names and faces of the others who had been wronged, she felt something unbreakable solidify within her. Going public, that's going to make us targets. Isn't it? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear prickling at the edges of her mind. Owens nodded, his gaze softening. Yes. Copeland won't back down easily. Men like him will try to discredit you, to paint you as the problem. They'll dig into your past, try to turn the narrative against you. But I'm here to support you. Alice, you won't be alone in this. Alice took a deep breath, her thoughts racing as she weighed her options. She thought of Sarah, of the fear in her daughter's eyes in the park, of the questions that no child should have to ask. She thought of the weight of history, of all the people before her who had stood up, who had endured, who had refused to be silenced. Finally, she looked up at Owens, her expression resolute. I'll do it. I can't let him keep doing this. Not to me, not to anyone. A flicker of respect passed over Owens's face, and he gave her a firm nod. Good. We'll do this the right way, with as much evidence and support as we can gather. I'll set up a meeting with a journalist I trust, a woman named Karen Matthews. She's dedicated to exposing cases of abuse and injustice. She'll make sure your story is told truthfully. Alice felt the gravity of her decision settle over her, but it didn't weigh her down. Instead, it filled her with a strange, fierce energy. She was ready to face whatever came next. As Owens prepared to leave, he turned back to her. One more thing, Alice, he said, his expression grave. I don't want to scare you, but you should know Copeland and others like him. They don't take challenges like this lightly. Be careful, keep your guard up, and don't hesitate to reach out if anything seems off. Alice nodded, a chill running down her spine. But she squared her shoulders, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Thank you, Derek. I'll be careful. After he left, Alice spent the rest of the day in a whirlwind of preparation. She reviewed her notes, thought through every detail of her encounter with Copeland, and mentally prepared herself for the interview. Each step forward felt like both a victory and a risk. But she knew she couldn't turn back now. That evening, as she tucked Sarah into bed, she kissed her daughter's forehead, feeling the familiar pang of love and protectiveness. Sarah looked up at her, eyes wide and serious. Mama, are you still mad at that man? Alice took a deep breath, her fingers brushing through Sarah's curls. Yes, baby, but it's not just about being mad. Sometimes, When someone does something wrong, it's our job to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to us. Not to anyone else. Sarah nodded, her small hand reaching out to touch her mother's face. Will I be brave like you someday, Mama? Alice's heart swelled, and she took Sarah's hand, holding it against her cheek. You already are, sweetheart. And remember, you never have to be afraid to stand up for what's right. No matter what. As she left Sarah's room, Alice felt the weight of the coming days settle around her. But it wasn't a burden. It was a mantle, a call to action. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Sarah. For every person who had ever been wronged. And for the hope of a world where justice wasn't just a word, but a promise. The next morning, Alice sat across from Karen Matthews, the journalist Owens had recommended. In a small, quiet cafe, Karen, a woman in her late 30s with a fierce, determined expression and a notebook filled with questions, listened intently as Alice recounted the events of the park. The fear, the shame, the determination that had followed. She spoke of Copeland's words, his violence, the audacity of his actions and her refusal to be silenced. As she spoke, Alice felt a catharsis, a release of emotions she hadn't realized she'd been holding in. Karen's eyes widened, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook, capturing every word, every nuance. By the end of their conversation, Karen looked at Alice with a respect and admiration that brought a warmth to her heart. This is a powerful story, Alice, Karen said, her voice filled with resolve. It's going to make waves. And people need to hear it. They need to know what's happening. To see the faces behind these stories. Alice nodded, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. Thank you for helping me tell it. Karen smiled, her eyes filled with a promise. It's my honor, Alice. And believe me, we'll make sure this story reaches as many people as possible. As Alice left the cafe, she felt a shift within her. A quiet but undeniable strength. She wasn't just Alice Dixon, the woman who'd been slapped in the park. She was a voice, a force, a symbol for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And with each step, she felt that voice grow stronger. The headline blazed across screens and newspapers the next morning, when those who swore to protect become the threat. Alice's story, accompanied by other testimonies from Copeland's previous victims, spread like wildfire. The article detailed her experience in the park, the pain and humiliation, and the surge of determination that led her to speak out. It included powerful images: Alice, resilient and unwavering, and Sarah, her innocent face marked by confusion and fear. Overnight, Alice had become a symbol, her story igniting conversations that would not be easily silenced. Alice awoke that morning to a flood of notifications, her phone buzzing with messages from friends, neighbors, even strangers who had read her story. The community rallied around her, messages of support pouring in, many of them expressing outrage at the injustice she had endured. Social media was ablaze with hashtags calling for accountability and reform. Comments and messages flooded her accounts, people thanking her for her bravery, for standing up and refusing to be silent. It was as if a dam had broken, and now there was no turning back. But along with the support, Alice knew there would be resistance. She had prepared herself for the backlash. Yet she could not help the chill that crept up her spine when she received her first threatening message. It was a text from an unknown number. You think you're brave? This isn't over. You'll regret making this public. She stared at the screen, a surge of anger and fear twisting in her chest. She quickly deleted the message, not wanting Sarah to see it. But the words lingered, casting a dark cloud over the morning. Determined to stay strong, Alice went about her day as usual, taking Sarah to school with a reassuring smile, keeping her voice calm and steady even as she felt the weight of invisible eyes watching her. Her every step felt heavy, her mind racing with thoughts of the unknown threats lurking around every corner. As she drove to work, she noticed a police car parked across the street, the officer inside glancing at her through the window. She could feel his gaze, piercing and cold, a silent reminder that she was being watched. The intimidation tactics only escalated as the day wore on. At work, Alice noticed patrol cars passing by the store where she worked, officers casting pointed glances through the windows. lingering just long enough to make their presence known. It felt like a game. A psychological strategy meant to unnerve her. To make her question herself. To force her into silence. But she reminded herself of Sarah's wide, trusting eyes. The pride in her daughter's voice when she called her brave. That memory alone kept Alice's resolve intact. Later that afternoon, as Alice was preparing to close up the store, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Derek Owens's name. She answered quickly, grateful for the familiar voice. "Hi, Derek," she said, trying to keep her tone light, though she knew he would hear the strain in her voice. "Alice," Owens replied, his voice steady but carrying a note of caution. "I just received a tip from someone in the department. Apparently, they're digging through your past, looking for anything they can use to discredit you." Alice gripped the phone tighter, anger flaring up within her. "So, they're trying to make me look like the problem," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "It's a classic tactic," Owens replied. "They want to shift the narrative. Make it look like you're the aggressor. That you have a history of issues. But I want you to know. We're prepared for this. I'll handle any legal fallout. And there are plenty of people standing with you. You're not alone in this." Alice took a deep breath, letting his words settle over her like a protective blanket. She had braced herself for this. But hearing it aloud made the threat feel more real, more tangible. Still, the knowledge that Owens was by her side, that he had anticipated every move Copeland and his allies might make, filled her with renewed strength. "Thank you, Derek," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm not backing down. I just need to know that Sarah will be safe through all of this." "She will be," Owens assured her. "I'll make sure of it. And remember, we have the truth on our side. No matter what they dig up or try to spin. The facts are with us." Alice nodded, her mind firm. "Good. Let them dig. I have nothing to hide." As she ended the call, she felt a rush of gratitude mixed with determination. She had put herself in the spotlight. Yes, but she was fighting for more than just herself. This was for everyone who had ever been silenced, intimidated, or mistreated. That night, as Alice tucked Sarah into bed, the familiar ritual held a new weight. Sarah looked up at her, her small face serious. "Mama, why are people being so mean?" she asked softly. Alice felt a pang in her heart, and she smoothed Sarah's hair, giving her a gentle smile. "Sometimes, baby, when people know they've done something wrong, they'll try to make others feel scared, so they don't have to face the truth. But just because they try doesn't mean we have to be afraid. We know what's right, and we stand by it." Sarah studied her mother for a moment, then nodded, a hint of pride in her young eyes. "You're still brave, Mama." Alice's heart swelled, and she kissed her daughter's forehead. "Thank you, baby. That means everything to me." The next morning, when Alice opened her front door to get the mail, she saw another police car parked across the street. The officer's gaze met hers, cold and unblinking, as if daring her to feel fear. Alice straightened, meeting his stare head-on before she went back inside, determined to show no sign of intimidation. As she sat down with the stack of mail, her phone buzzed. It was another notification, a flood of messages that began with praise and encouragement but soon took on a darker tone. There were anonymous messages, some accusing her of stirring up trouble, others filled with veiled threats and warnings. She felt a familiar twinge of fear but pushed it aside. She had expected this, and she refused to let these cowards hiding behind screens control her. Later in the day, she received another call from Owens, his tone more urgent this time. "Alice, I just got word. There's more talk in the department about revisiting your record, trying to dig up anything they can use." Alice felt her pulse quicken, anger sparking in her chest. "So, they're planning to paint me as the villain?" "Yes, but I want you to know. We're prepared for this. And there's something else. I've spoken with a few reporters who want to dig deeper into Copeland's past and into the department itself. The public support is growing. And we have allies. This story isn't going away. And they know it." A flicker of relief passed through Alice. The truth was on their side. And as much as the threats weighed on her, she felt a fierce satisfaction in knowing that Copeland and his allies were losing control of the narrative. In the days that followed, Alice's story continued to spread. igniting conversations across the city. With every article, every post, every message of support, her resolve grew stronger. People stopped her in the street. Strangers who had read her story offering words of encouragement, thanking her for her bravery. But with every show of support came escalating threats, late-night calls. Strange cars parked outside her home. Anonymous messages reminding her that Copeland's supporters wouldn't back down. One evening, as Alice was closing up the store, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned, her pulse quickening, and found herself face to face with Officer Copeland. His face was twisted into a smug smile. His posture relaxed but menacing as he loomed over her. "You couldn't just let it go, could you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero, stirring up trouble for people like me." Alice's heart pounded, but she held her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "You don't scare me, Copeland," she replied, her voice steady. "You're nothing more than a bully hiding behind a badge. And I'm not going to let you, or anyone else, intimidate me." For a brief moment, his smile faltered, replaced by a flash of rage. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His voice a low, threatening growl. "You think you're brave? You're just a pawn in a game you don't understand. People like me were untouchable. You can scream and cry all you want. But in the end, I'll still be here. And you'll be nothing." Alice met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "We'll see about that. People like you always think you're invincible. But nothing lasts forever." He let out a hollow laugh, the sound echoing in the empty store. "Keep dreaming. But remember, don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Alice standing alone, her hands clenched into fists, her mind swirling with a mixture of fear, anger, and defiance. She knew the road ahead would be hard, that Copeland and his supporters would try everything to destroy her. But she also knew she wasn't alone. The community, Owens, Sarah, they all stood with her. The next morning, Owens called with news that sent a thrill of hope through her. "Alice, the public pressure is building. The department has announced they're opening an investigation into Copeland. This is a huge step. It's the first real step toward accountability." Alice felt a surge of relief and a glimmer of hope. But Owens's voice carried a warning. "But don't let your guard down. Copeland and his allies won't take this lightly. They're likely to retaliate, to try to make things as difficult as possible for you." Alice's resolve only grew stronger. "I understand, Derek. I'm ready for whatever comes next." And as she looked out the window, the city sprawled before her. She knew this was just the beginning. Copeland and his supporters would fight. But so would she. She was standing up not only for herself but for Sarah, for her community, and for every person who had ever been made to feel small. In that moment, Alice knew that no matter what lay ahead, she would not back down. The news of the internal investigation into Officer Copeland sent ripples across the city. For the first time in years, the police department found itself under the glaring light of public scrutiny. And Copeland's allies, those who had long protected him, were feeling the pressure. But Alice knew this small victory would come at a price. Men like Copeland didn't go down without a fight. And now, more than ever, she had to brace herself for the storm she had stirred. The backlash began subtly, almost as if testing the waters. On her way to work, Alice noticed police cars trailing behind her at a slow, deliberate pace, as if reminding her that she was always within their sights. The stares, the pointed looks from officers she didn't recognize, they were silent but clear threats. But it wasn't long before these silent gestures transformed into more aggressive forms of intimidation. One night, as she and Sarah were having dinner, there was a loud bang on the door. Alice's heart raced as she stood up, instructing Sarah to stay put while she went to answer. When she opened the door, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on her doorstep. She hesitated before picking it up, feeling a chill run down her spine. Inside was a single, typed note. "Silence is safer." There was no signature, no trace of who might have left it. But Alice didn't need a signature to understand the message. Alice forced herself to stay calm, tucking the note out of sight before returning to Sarah, who looked up at her with worried eyes. "Who was it, Mama?" Sarah asked. Alice gave her a reassuring smile, even as her heart hammered in her chest. "Just a prank. Baby, she said softly, nothing to worry about. But as she lay awake that night, listening to every creak and shift in the house, she knew this was no prank. Copeland's supporters wanted her to know that she was stepping out of line and they intended to make her pay for it. The next day, Alice met with Derek Owens to discuss the situation. As they sat in his office, she laid the note on the table, her face hard but her hands trembling slightly. Owens studied it for a moment, his jaw tightening. "This is an intimidation tactic," he said, his voice edged with anger. "They're trying to scare you into backing down. Make you second-guess yourself." Alice nodded, her expression resolute. "I expected them to fight back. But," she paused, her gaze distant as she thought of Sarah's small, trusting face. "I didn't expect it to feel so personal." Owens leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with fierce determination. "They're scared, Alice. They know they're losing control. And when people like Copeland lose control, they get desperate. But that's exactly why we have to keep going. You're not alone in this. The community, the media, everyone's watching now." His words bolstered her resolve, and she felt a flicker of hope amid the tension. She had come this far, she wouldn't let fear dictate her actions now. Still, the weight of the threats loomed over her like a storm cloud. A constant reminder that the fight was only just beginning. That evening, as she walked to her car after work, she noticed a group of officers standing nearby, watching her with cold, appraising eyes. She could feel the weight of their gazes as she climbed into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she drove away. She knew they wanted her to feel vulnerable, that they wanted her to second-guess her decisions, to fear for her safety. But instead, she felt her determination solidify. She refused to let them win, to let them see even a flicker of doubt or fear. A few nights later, Alice was working late, going over her notes for an upcoming interview with a news outlet. She had just locked up the store and was walking toward her car when she heard footsteps behind her. Her pulse quickened as she turned and found herself face to face with Officer Copeland. His face was twisted into a smug smile, his eyes filled with a dark satisfaction that sent a chill through her. "Couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" he sneered, stepping closer until his face was inches from hers. "Thought you'd play the hero. Stir up trouble for me and my friends." Alice's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "You don't scare me, Copeland," she said, her voice firm. "You're nothing more than a bully. And people like you can't keep hiding forever." A flicker of irritation passed over his face, but he masked it quickly, leaning in until she could feel his breath on her cheek. "Oh, you'll find out just how wrong you are. People like me were untouchable. We've been doing this long before you ever thought you could make a difference. And nothing you do is going to change that." Alice felt the weight of his words, the venom in his tone. But she stood her ground. She had come too far to be intimidated now. "You may think you're untouchable," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But nothing lasts forever. The truth is coming out. And when it does, you'll be left standing alone." He let out a hollow laugh, the sound echoing in the empty street. "You're more naive than I thought. Keep dreaming, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Alice standing there, her heart pounding but her resolve intact. She knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd try to intimidate her. But she also knew that she wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for Sarah, for her community, and for every person who had ever been made to feel powerless. The next day, Alice received a call from a reporter from a major news outlet who wanted to interview her on camera. It was a risky step, but she knew the power of visibility, of letting people see her face, hear her story. When she arrived at the studio, the crew greeted her warmly, and the reporter, a woman named Lisa Cho, explained that they would dive deep into her story, highlighting the systemic issues behind her experience with Copeland. As the interview began, Lisa's questions cut to the heart of Alice's experience, probing her fears, her motivations, and the toll the fight had taken on her and her family. But Alice answered each question with a calm resolve, her voice steady as she recounted the harassment, the threats, and the injustice she had endured. She spoke not just for herself but for Sarah, for the countless others who had been wronged by the very people sworn to protect them. Do you regret coming forward, Alice? Lisa asked, her gaze searching. Alice took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to Sarah's frightened face. The intimidation, the threats, the fear that had haunted her nights. But then she thought of the outpouring of support, of the voices that had risen alongside hers, of Owens and the community standing by her side. No, she said firmly, her voice unwavering. I don't regret it, not for a second. This fight isn't just for me. It's for everyone who has ever been silenced, who has ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. It's for my daughter, so she knows she never has to accept being treated as less than anyone else. So, no, I don't regret it. I'm just getting started. The interview aired that night, and Alice's words reverberated across the city. Messages of support flooded in once again, and as she scrolled through them, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. But the victory was tempered by the knowledge that Copeland and his allies would not take this lightly. That night, as she lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house, her phone buzzed with a new message. She unlocked it, only to see another ominous text. You're pushing your luck. Walk away while you still can. She stared at the words, a shiver running through her. But she quickly deleted the message, refusing to let the fear take hold. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. Copeland's supporters made their presence known, parking outside her home, their vehicles casting long shadows over her front lawn. The phone calls became relentless, each one a reminder that the fight was far from over. But every time she felt her courage waver, she thought of Sarah, of the bright future she wanted for her daughter. A future free of intimidation and fear. One evening, as Alice was preparing to leave work, her phone rang. It was Owens. Alice, I wanted you to hear it from me first. The department's response to the investigation has been swift. Copeland has been placed on suspension pending further review. Alice felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from her shoulders. So it's really happening? They're finally holding him accountable? Owens's voice softened. This is a huge step, Alice, and it's all because of you. But remember, it's not over. They're going to push back harder than ever now. You need to be prepared. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I understand, but I'm not backing down. After the call ended, Alice sat in her car, letting the news sink in. Copeland's suspension was a victory, but she knew the battle was far from over. Still, she felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of strength that had grown with every step of this journey. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for every person who had been silenced, for every voice that deserved to be heard. As she drove home that night, the city lights stretched out before her, illuminating the path ahead, and as she turned onto her street, she caught sight of Sarah waiting at the window, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes filled with pride and love. Alice knew the fight would continue, that the road would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt unbreakable. She had found her voice, and she would not be silenced. As news of Copeland's suspension spread, the city seemed to come alive with both tension and anticipation. On one side, a wave of support flowed in for Alice, people inspired by her bravery to step forward with their own stories, each testimony painting a grim picture of the abuse that had been hidden for so long. But on the other side, backlash surged, an ugly undercurrent of doubt and anger from those loyal to Copeland. Convinced that she was an agitator stirring up trouble, Alice could feel the city's divide in every look cast her way, every whispered word that trailed behind her as she walked down the street. Some greeted her with warmth, nods of respect, or even words of encouragement, but others glared, their expressions filled with suspicion or disdain, as if she had disrupted the peace they clung to. Yet, she walked with her head held high, her resolve unbroken. She was ready for the battle she had ignited, even if it meant standing alone. One afternoon, she received a call from Derek Owens. His tone was grim, and Alice could sense the weight of his words even before he spoke. Alice, there's something you need to know, he began. Copeland's supporters are organizing. They're gathering petitions, pushing back against the investigation, trying to paint you as the villain. They're stirring up as much controversy as they can, and they've gained some traction with local media. Alice felt a familiar chill run through her. But she steeled herself. So they're trying to turn this around. Make it look like I'm the one in the wrong? Exactly, Owens replied. But I'm not calling just to warn you. I have some good news. Too. We've got more witnesses stepping forward. People who have experienced the same harassment and abuse. They're willing to testify, to help strengthen the case. The city's starting to listen. Alice. But we need to keep pushing. Alice felt a surge of gratitude and determination. Thank you, Derek. I knew this wouldn't be easy. But I'm ready to keep fighting. I'm not backing down. A few days later, Alice found herself at a community gathering organized by a local advocacy group. The group had reached out after her story went public, inviting her to speak about her experiences, to inspire others to share their own. The room was filled with people, community members, activists, local journalists, all of them gathered to support her, to show her that she was not alone. As Alice stepped up to the podium, she looked out at the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and determination. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. Thank you all for being here. She began, her voice carrying through the room. This fight, our fight, is not just about one person or one incident. It's about a system that has been allowed to turn a blind eye to injustice, to tolerate abuse. It's about people like Officer Copeland who believe they're untouchable because no one has dared to stand up to them. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her, each one attentive, filled with hope or pain or solidarity. But that's changing now. We're changing it. By speaking out. By refusing to be silent. We're showing them that we won't tolerate this anymore. Not for ourselves. Not for our children. Not for anyone. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the room with a powerful, electric energy. Alice felt a surge of strength, bolstered by the support of those around her. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she saw Sarah in the crowd, her young face beaming with pride, her small hands clapping alongside everyone else. In that moment, Alice knew she was exactly where she needed to be. But as the applause faded, Alice noticed a figure standing in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching her with cold, scrutinizing eyes. It was one of Copeland's supporters, a man she recognized as a former colleague of his. He seemed out of place among the crowd of supporters, his presence a stark reminder that this fight was far from over. She felt a chill, but she refused to let it shake her. After the event, as Alice and Sarah were walking to their car, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to see the same man from the back of the room approaching them, his face a mixture of contempt and anger. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? He sneered, his voice low but filled with venom. Stirring up trouble for good men who've done nothing but protect this city. Alice squared her shoulders, her hand instinctively moving to hold Sarah's. She refused to let him intimidate her. If you consider harassment and abuse protecting the city, then you're as much a part of the problem as he is. The man took a step closer, his voice a harsh whisper. You're making enemies, Alice. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens when people like us are pushed too far. Alice met his gaze, her expression unflinching. Go ahead and threaten me. I'm not afraid. I have the truth on my side. And I'm not going anywhere. He gave her a mocking smile, his eyes glinting with malice. Keep telling yourself that. But remember, the higher you climb, the harder the fall. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Alice and Sarah standing in the parking lot, the echoes of his words lingering in the air. Alice felt a shiver run down her spine. But she forced herself to stay calm. She had expected resistance, she had expected threats. But she hadn't expected them to come this close to Sarah, to confront her so brazenly. As they drove home, Alice glanced at Sarah, who sat quietly, staring out the window. She could see the worry etched on her daughter's face, the questions in her eyes. When they arrived home, Alice sat down with her, pulling her close, her voice soft and reassuring. Sarah, I know this is scary, she began, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. But I need you to remember something. People who do bad things, they're often afraid of the truth. They're afraid of being exposed, of losing their power. That's why they try to scare us. Sarah looked up at her, her eyes wide. But they don't scare you, do they, Mama? Alice smiled, a fierce determination shining in her gaze. No, baby, they don't. Because we have something they don't have, the truth. And as long as we hold on to that, they can't win. Sarah nodded, her small hand reaching out to hold her mother's. I'm proud of you, Mama. Alice hugged her tightly, feeling the strength of her daughter's love and admiration. It was all she needed to keep going, to face whatever came next. The next day, as Alice walked into Owens's office, she was greeted by a look of pride and urgency on his face. Alice, the witness list has grown. People are coming forward, and with every new testimony, the case against Copeland and his allies gets stronger. Alice felt a surge of hope. The tide was turning, and she could sense the momentum building. Owens continued, the pressure is mounting, and the department is feeling it. They know they can't ignore this much longer. We're going to get justice. Alice. As she left his office, Alice felt a quiet strength settle over her. She was no longer the woman who had been struck in the park. Humiliated and silenced, she had become a voice for her community, a force for change, and she could feel the impact of her actions rippling out around her. That evening, she received a call from one of the reporters covering the case. Alice, I wanted to let you know there's going to be a public hearing. The department is going to address the complaints against Copeland and his supporters. They'll have to answer for their actions. Alice felt a thrill of anticipation. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. She hung up, a sense of purpose filling her as she prepared for what lay ahead. And as she lay down that night, Sarah sleeping peacefully beside her, Alice knew that she was ready. She had faced her fear, withstood the threats, and stood her ground. And now, as the city prepared for the hearing, she was more determined than ever to see justice served. In the stillness of the night, with her daughter's soft breathing beside her, Alice felt the weight of the journey they had taken together. She had found her voice, her courage, and her strength, and she would not let anyone take it from her. The day of the public hearing arrived, casting a heavy silence over the city as people gathered outside the courthouse. News cameras lined the sidewalks, reporters hurriedly prepping their coverage, and community members filled the steps, their faces etched with anticipation. Alice arrived with Derek Owens by her side, her heart pounding as she took in the crowd, the reporters, the tension thick in the air. The stakes had never felt higher, but the sight of her community standing with her gave her the strength she needed to keep moving forward. As Alice made her way up the courthouse steps, a few people began to clap, and soon, the applause spread throughout the crowd. Voices called out in support, strangers and friends alike reaching out to encourage her. She felt a warmth settle over her, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her story had resonated with others, sparked something in people who had once felt powerless. Today, she would stand before the city not just for herself but for everyone who had been silenced. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. A sea of faces turned to watch as Alice took her seat near the front, her hands trembling slightly but her expression resolute. Across the aisle, Officer Copeland sat, flanked by his legal team, his face a mask of defiance. He refused to meet Alice's gaze, but she could sense the tension in his rigid posture, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The judge entered, calling the room to order, and the hearing began. One by one, witnesses stepped forward, each recounting their own experiences with Copeland and his allies, painting a portrait of a man who had used his authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harm. As Alice listened to their testimonies, she felt both anger and validation. Their stories, each one a piece of the puzzle, came together to reveal the truth she had known all along. Then it was Alice's turn to take the stand. She rose slowly, every eye in the room fixed on her as she made her way to the front. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their hopes, their fears. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she looked out over the courtroom. My name is Alice Dixon, she began, her voice clear and steady. And I'm here today because I refuse to be silenced. She described the events of that night in the park, her voice unwavering as she recounted every detail, the cruel words, the slap, the humiliation in front of her daughter. She spoke of the fear that had settled in her heart, the sense of violation that had haunted her since. But she also spoke of her resolve, of her decision to stand up not just for herself but for her daughter and for everyone else who had ever been made to feel small. When Officer Copeland struck me, he wanted me to feel powerless, she said, her voice filling the room. He wanted me to believe that people like me don't have a place in this city. That we should know our place. But I'm here today to say that we do belong. That we will not be made to feel lesser. And that we will not accept intimidation and abuse as a normal part of our lives. The room was silent, every eye on Alice as her words hung in the air. A powerful reminder of the strength it took to stand up to injustice. She looked over at Copeland, meeting his gaze for the first time. His face was tight, his expression unreadable, but she could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that her defiance had sparked. As she finished her testimony, the crowd in the courtroom erupted into murmurs, whispers of support and admiration rippling through the room. Alice returned to her seat beside Derek, who gave her a nod of approval. She had done it, she had spoken her truth in front of the city. And she knew she had made an impact. The day wore on, filled with more testimonies, more stories, each one adding to the case against Copeland. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. And as the hearing drew to a close, Alice felt a sense of hope settle over her, a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. But just as the judge was preparing to dismiss the court, Copeland's attorney stood, his expression smug as he motioned to the judge. "Your Honor, we request permission to call a final witness," he announced, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "A character witness for Officer Copeland." The judge granted permission, and a man stood up at the back of the room, a former officer. One of Copeland's oldest friends. He took the stand and began to paint a picture of Copeland as a dedicated, hard-working officer, someone who had always put the community's safety first. His words were careful, calculated, each one a deliberate attempt to sway the court's sympathy back toward Copeland. Alice felt a flicker of anger as she listened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew this was a tactic, a last-ditch effort to salvage Copeland's reputation. Yet as the witness continued to speak, Alice noticed something unexpected. The crowd, which had been silent, began to murmur, their disbelief and anger growing with each of the witness's words. People shifted in their seats, some shaking their heads, others whispering to their neighbors. The attempt to portray Copeland as a hero was falling flat. Finally, the judge silenced the room, calling for order, and turned to Copeland's attorney. "Do you have any further evidence to present?" he asked, his voice edged with a hint of impatience. The attorney shook his head, looking visibly frustrated. "No, Your Honor," he replied, his voice tight. With that, the judge called for closing statements, and Derek Owens rose to speak on Alice's behalf. His words were powerful, each one a direct challenge to the abuse and corruption that had been exposed. He spoke of justice, of the need for accountability, and of the courage it took for people like Alice to come forward in the face of intimidation. "The truth is that Officer Copeland betrayed the trust placed in him by this community," Owens declared, his voice filled with conviction. "He used his badge as a weapon, wielding his authority not to protect but to control, to demean, and to terrify. And today, we have the chance to take a stand against that abuse, to show that no one is above the law." As Owens finished his statement, the room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. The judge dismissed the court, announcing that the decision would be delivered in the coming days. Alice stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights casting a warm glow over the streets. The crowd from the courtroom gathered around her, voices of support and gratitude filling the space as people reached out to thank her, to tell her that she had given them hope. She felt a rush of emotion, a sense of pride mixed with relief, knowing that she had done everything she could. Just as she was about to leave, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "Alice, do you have any final words for the community?" he asked, his eyes filled with curiosity. Alice paused, gathering her thoughts. Before speaking, "I want to thank everyone who has stood by me. Everyone who has found the courage to share their own stories. This fight isn't just about me or one incident, it's about creating a future where no one has to face this kind of treatment. Where people can feel safe in their own communities. I believe we're on the right path. And I won't stop until we see real change." The reporter nodded, capturing her words with a sense of reverence. And Alice felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her. She had turned her pain into a force for good. A catalyst for change that was rippling through the city. And she knew that her journey was far from over. As she and Sarah walked to their car, the sounds of the crowd faded into the background, leaving them in a comfortable silence. Sarah looked up at her, her young face shining with admiration. "You did it, Mama," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. Alice smiled, pulling her daughter close. "We did it, baby, and we're not done yet." That night, as Alice lay awake, the events of the day replayed in her mind: the testimonies, the crowd, the strength she had drawn from those around her. She knew that the coming days would be crucial, that the judge's decision would be the final piece in this chapter of her fight. But no matter the outcome, she had already achieved something greater than she had ever imagined. She had given her community a voice. She had inspired others to stand up, to refuse to be silenced. And in doing so, she had forged a legacy of courage and resilience, one that would live on long after the hearing was over. As sleep finally claimed her, Alice felt a quiet, unbreakable strength settle within her. She was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that she had the support of her community, the love of her daughter, and a fierce determination that no one could ever take away. The city was quiet in the early morning hours as Alice prepared for what would be one of the most pivotal days of her life. Today, the verdict would be announced. The culmination of her fight, her sacrifices, and her courage had led to this moment. She stood before the mirror, hands resting on the bathroom sink, taking deep, calming breaths. She could feel the weight of everything she had been through pressing down on her. But today, she felt a resolve stronger than ever before. This was her moment to prove that truth could prevail. As Alice and Sarah arrived at the courthouse, they were met with a crowd that seemed to have doubled in size since the hearing. Supporters from all walks of life had gathered, their faces filled with anticipation and solidarity. Reporters scrambled to get their positions, cameras flashing as Alice made her way up the steps, Sarah's hand clasped tightly in hers. Derek Owens was waiting for them near the entrance, his expression a mixture of pride and determination. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension, and every whisper, every glance, seemed charged with the weight of the decision to come. Across the room, Officer Copeland sat with his attorney, his face unreadable but his posture rigid. He looked straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the murmurs of the crowd or the hopeful glances cast toward Alice. She could feel his resentment, his refusal to back down, even as the walls closed in around him. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and the room fell silent. Alice's heart pounded as the judge prepared to announce the verdict, the final judgment that would determine the outcome of her fight. She held her breath, her hand tightening around Sarah's, as she waited for the words that would either mark a victory for justice or a bitter setback. The judge's voice was steady, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling on Copeland. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, and taking into account the testimonies of multiple witnesses, he began, his voice carrying a note of finality. The court finds Officer Mark Copeland guilty of misconduct, abuse of authority, and assault. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then, as the reality of the verdict settled in, the crowd erupted in applause. Voices called out in support. Tears filled people's eyes, and hands reached out to Alice, thanking her for her courage, her strength, her determination to see this fight through. Alice felt a wave of relief wash over her, her body trembling with the intensity of the moment. She looked down at Sarah, who was beaming up at her, pride and love shining in her young eyes. In that instant, Alice knew that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every fearful glance over her shoulder had been worth it. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be silenced. And now she had won not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or invisible. As the judge continued, issuing a statement about the need for accountability and reform within the police department, Alice felt a glimmer of hope. This was more than a victory against one man. It was a step toward dismantling the structures that had allowed people like Copeland to operate unchecked. It was a chance for real change. Derek Owens leaned over, his voice soft but filled with emotion. Alice, you did it. This isn't just your victory, it's a win for the entire community. Alice nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. We did it, Derek. I couldn't have done this without everyone who believed in me, who supported me through it all. After the judge dismissed the court, Alice stood to leave, but before she could reach the exit, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand, eyes shining with admiration. Alice, how do you feel about today's verdict? He asked, his voice trembling with excitement. Alice took a moment to gather her thoughts. Glancing at Sarah, who gave her an encouraging smile, she faced the reporter, her voice strong and clear. I feel hopeful. Today's decision is a reminder that truth and justice can prevail. But this isn't just about one person or one case. It's about a system that needs to be held accountable. About ensuring that people are treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. And I'm going to keep fighting for that. As she spoke, the crowd around her cheered, their applause filling the air with an undeniable energy, a sense of unity and strength that transcended the walls of the courthouse. Alice felt a surge of gratitude, her heart swelling with pride as she looked at the faces around her. Each one a testament to the impact her fight had made. But as she stepped outside, a familiar figure caught her eye. Standing at the edge of the crowd was Copeland, his face twisted in a mixture of resentment and defiance. His career was over, his reputation shattered, but Alice knew that men like him rarely admitted defeat. He glared at her, his expression filled with the promise of retribution. But she refused to be intimidated. She held his gaze, her eyes filled with quiet strength, silently communicating that she was no longer afraid. Later that night, as Alice sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, reflecting on the day's events, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Derek Owens. Congratulations, Alice. The community is rallying around you, and they want to support your mission. They're already asking how they can help create change. Alice read the message, a sense of purpose settling over her. She had won the fight against Copeland, but her work was far from over. This was just the beginning of a larger journey, one that would involve standing up for others, creating spaces where people could feel safe, and challenging the systems that allowed abuse to flourish. As the days passed, Alice found herself inundated with messages from community members, activists, and even lawmakers, all of whom were eager to join her cause. She and Derek Owens worked tirelessly to create a foundation, voices unbroken, dedicated to supporting victims of abuse, advocating for reform, and ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. On the foundation's opening day, Alice took the stage in front of a crowd of supporters, friends, and allies. She looked out at the faces before her, faces filled with hope, strength, and a shared commitment to justice. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. Voices Unbroken exists because no one deserves to be made to feel small or powerless. We deserve to be heard, to be respected, to be treated with dignity. Today, we stand together to ensure that our voices will never be silenced again. And together, we will create a future where justice isn't just a dream, it's a reality. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the city. A powerful reminder that Alice's fight had ignited something greater than herself. She had transformed her pain into a force for change, inspiring others to stand with her, to believe that they, too, could make a difference. As the event ended, Sarah ran up to her, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. Mom, you did it. You really did it. Alice knelt down, pulling her daughter close, her eyes shining with tears of pride and love. We did it, Sarah. And we're going to keep doing it for everyone who needs us. As they left the event, hand in hand, Alice felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had come a long way from that night in the park. From the fear and the pain that had once threatened to consume her. She had emerged stronger, with a purpose that extended beyond herself. A mission that would carry her forward no matter what challenges lay ahead. Alice Dixon had found her voice. And with it, she had created a legacy of courage, resilience, and justice. And as she looked out over the city, she knew that her journey was far from over. With her community beside her, her daughter's love guiding her, and an unbreakable determination within, she was ready to face whatever the future held. knowing that together, they would continue to fight for a world where everyone's voice could be heard.